The lightning cracked across the October sky like God himself was tearing the heavens apart. And there I was, standing in my empty kitchen at 2 in the morning, clutching a cold cup of coffee that had gone untouched for hours. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very foundation of the house that Robert and I had called home for 37 years. But nothing could shake me anymore. Nothing could touch the numbness that had settled into my bones like winter frost that refuses to thaw. That's when I heard it. A sound that cut through the storm's fury like a knife through silk. A whimpering, a cry so desperate and broken that it made my heart, which I thought had forgotten how to feel anything, suddenly lurch back to life. Speech balloon, I'd love to know. What time is it where you are right now? And which city or state are you watching from? My name is Margaret Thompson, and 6 months before that stormy night, I buried my husband of 37 years. Robert had been my everything, my morning coffee companion, my evening news debate partner, my steady hand when the world felt too heavy to carry alone. When the doctors told us about the cancer, we faced it together like we'd faced everything else. But cancer doesn't care about love stories or wedding anniversaries or the garden you planted together every spring for decades. Robert died on a Tuesday morning in April, and I remember thinking how wrong that felt. Tuesdays were supposed to be ordinary. They were supposed to be filled with grocery shopping and laundry and the mundane rhythms of married life. They weren't supposed to be the day your whole world crumbled into dust. I held his hand as he took his last breath, and I swear I felt something break inside my chest. Not just my heart, though that shattered too. Something deeper. Something fundamental. The part of me that had learned to hope, to dream, to believe that tomorrow would be better than today. That part died with Robert on that ordinary Tuesday morning, and I wasn't sure it would ever come back to life. The house had become a mausoleum of memories. Robert's reading glasses still sat on the nightstand where he'd left them, folded neatly next to the book he'd never finished reading. His favorite coffee mug remained unwashed in the sink because I couldn't bear to clean away the last trace of his lips. The silence was suffocating, pressing against my chest until some nights I wondered if I'd simply stop breathing and join him wherever souls go when they leave this broken world behind. Every room held ghosts. The kitchen where he'd made me pancakes every Sunday morning for 37 years. The living room where we'd watch the news together, arguing good-naturedly about politics and laughing at the weatherman's increasingly creative ways to say it was going to rain. The bedroom where we'd whispered our dreams and fears in the darkness, where we'd held each other through nightmares and celebrations and everything in between. I'd stopped sleeping in our bedroom 3 weeks after the funeral. The queen-sized bed felt like an ocean of emptiness, and his pillow still carried the faint scent of his aftershave. Instead, I'd taken to falling asleep in his old recliner in the living room, surrounded by photo albums I couldn't bring myself to open and sympathy cards I couldn't bear to throw away. The cards had stopped coming after the first month. The flowers had wilted and been thrown away. The casseroles from well-meaning neighbors had been eaten or frozen or given away to anyone who would take them. The world had moved on, as worlds do, leaving me behind in a house that felt too big and too quiet and too full of memories I wasn't ready to face. My children lived states away, busy with their own lives and families. Sarah was in California, managing a marketing firm and raising twin boys who barely knew their grandmother. Michael was in Texas, working oil rigs and sending postcards from places with names I couldn't pronounce. They called every few days, their voices careful and measured, asking how I was doing. I always said fine. I always lied. How do you tell your children that their mother had become a ghost haunting her own life? The neighbors had stopped bringing casseroles after the first month. Mrs. Henderson from next door still waved when she saw me collecting mail in my bathrobe at 3 in the afternoon, but the invitation in her eyes had faded to polite concern. The friends who'd promised to check on me regularly had slowly faded back into their own routines. I understood. Grief makes people uncomfortable. It's a reminder that love stories end, that happily ever after is just something we tell ourselves to sleep better at night. I'd stopped caring about my appearance somewhere around month 3. My gray hair, which Robert had always said was beautiful as spun silver, hung limp and unwashed around my shoulders. I wore the same black sweater for days at a time, finding comfort in its familiar weight against my skin. Food had lost all taste and meaning. I ate because I had to, not because I wanted to. Crackers and canned soup became my primary sustenance, consumed standing at the kitchen counter while staring out at the garden Robert and I had tended together. The garden was dying too. The roses he'd planted for our 20th anniversary were overgrown and wild. The vegetable patch where we'd grown tomatoes and peppers and herbs was choked with weeds. The bird bath he'd installed so we could watch cardinals and blue jays from the kitchen window was dry and covered in fallen leaves. It felt appropriate somehow. Everything beautiful in my world was withering away. But that October night, as the storm raged outside with a fury that matched the chaos in my soul, everything changed. The storm had been building all day. I'd watched it approach from my kitchen window, the sky turning that peculiar green-black color that promises violence. The Weather Service had issued warnings about high winds and hail, advising people to stay indoors and secure loose objects. I had nowhere to go and nothing to secure. My life had already been torn apart by forces beyond my control. The power had flickered twice during the evening, plunging the house into darkness before humming back to life. Each time, I'd found myself hoping it would stay off. Maybe darkness would be easier than facing another sleepless night, surrounded by reminders of what I'd lost. But at 2 in the morning, standing in my kitchen with that cold cup of coffee, listening to the wind howl around the corners of the house like a living thing in pain, I heard something else. Something that didn't belong to the storm. The whimpering came again, closer now, and I realized it was coming from just beyond my back porch. I set down the cold coffee and moved toward the sliding glass door. My bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. Robert had refinished himself the summer before his diagnosis. He'd been so proud of that project, spending weeks sanding and staining until the wood gleamed like honey in the afternoon light. The rain was coming down in sheets so thick I could barely see 3 feet into the darkness of our backyard. The ancient oak tree that dominated our lawn was bending in the wind, its branches creaking and groaning with the strain. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark, stroboscopic bursts, turning familiar shapes strange and menacing. I flicked on the porch light, and that's when I saw him. Huddled against the lattice work beneath our deck was the most pitiful sight I'd ever witnessed. A German shepherd, soaked to the bone, his dark fur matted against his thin frame. He couldn't have been more than 2 years old, but his eyes held the kind of ancient sadness that comes from knowing abandonment. His left front paw was tucked up against his chest in a way that spoke of injury, and his whole body trembled with cold and fear. Those eyes! Oh God, those eyes! They were the color of amber honey, and when they met mine through the glass, I saw something I recognized. I saw my own brokenness reflected back at me. I saw a soul that had given up hope, that had learned to expect nothing but pain from the world. He was pressed as far back under the deck as he could manage, trying to escape the driving rain. But there was no real shelter there. Water dripped steadily from the deck above, and the wind whipped around the lattice work, offering little protection from the storm's fury. His ears were pinned flat against his skull, and his tail was tucked so tightly between his legs it was barely visible. The rational part of my mind, the part that Robert used to call my practical side, whispered all the reasons why I should call animal control in the morning. I was 64 years old. I was grieving. I could barely take care of myself, let alone a wounded animal. I had no experience with dogs. Robert had been allergic, so we'd never had pets. Our house wasn't set up for animals. I didn't know the first thing about veterinary care or dog food, or any of the 1,000 details that came with pet ownership. But standing there in my nightgown, watching this beautiful broken creature suffer in the storm, I felt something stir in my chest that I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't quite hope. It was smaller than that, more fragile. It was the tiniest spark of purpose, the faintest whisper that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely useless in this world. This dog needed help. And for the first time since Robert's death, something needed me. I slid open the door, and the wind immediately whipped my gray hair across my face. The rain stung my skin like tiny needles, but I stepped out onto the porch anyway. The wooden planks were slick with water, and I had to grab the railing to keep from slipping. The storm was even more violent than it had seemed from inside. The wind roared through the trees with a sound like freight trains, and the rain came at me horizontally, soaking through my thin nightgown in seconds. The German shepherd lifted his head at the sound, those honey-colored eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. He didn't move toward me, but he didn't try to flee either. He just watched, waiting to see if I was another source of pain, or if I might, just possibly, be something else. "Easy boy," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm. "It's okay. You're safe now." The words felt strange on my tongue. When was the last time I'd spoken words of comfort to another living creature? When was the last time I'd felt capable of offering safety to anyone or anything? He didn't run. That broke my heart more than anything else could have. This dog was so broken, so defeated, that he didn't even have the energy left to flee from a stranger. He just watched me with those ancient eyes as I knelt down on the wet wooden planks of my porch, ignoring the way the rain soaked through my thin nightgown and the cold seeped into my bones. The storm raged around us, but in that moment, kneeling on my porch looking into the eyes of this wounded animal, I felt something like peace settle over me. Not happiness, not yet, but a kind of stillness that I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. "I'm not going to hurt you, sweetheart," I said, extending my hand slowly. "I know what it's like to be scared and alone." The words hung in the air between us, and I realized I was talking as much to myself as I was to him. When was the last time I'd spoken out loud in this house? When was the last time my voice had carried anything other than silent prayers to a God I wasn't sure was listening? The dog's nose twitched as he caught my scent. His ears, which had been pinned flat against his head, perked up slightly. Something in his posture shifted, some invisible wall beginning to crack. He stretched his neck forward, just an inch, just enough to sniff at my fingertips. His nose was cold and wet against my skin, and the simple contact sent a jolt through my entire being. It had been so long since I'd touched another living creature. So long since I'd felt needed by anything or anyone. Robert had been gone 6 months, but it felt like 6 years since I'd experienced the simple pleasure of physical contact with something warm and alive. The dog sniffed my hand carefully, his nostrils flaring as he processed my scent. I could see intelligence in his eyes, a careful evaluation of threat versus opportunity. Someone had hurt him badly enough that he expected pain from human contact, but he was still hoping, despite everything, that this time might be different. That's when I noticed the collar. Hidden beneath his matted fur was a leather collar, worn and weathered but still intact. The leather was good quality, the kind you'd buy for a beloved pet, not a stray. With trembling fingers, I reached for the metal tag hanging from it, squinting to read the engraved letters in the dim porch light. The name on the tag read Shadow. Below it was a phone number, but the metal was so scratched and corroded that I could only make out a few digits. Someone had loved this dog once. Someone had given him a name and a home, and probably a warm bed and regular meals, and all the things that make a dog's life complete. And then, for reasons I couldn't fathom, he'd ended up here. Broken. Abandoned. Left to weather the storm alone. Just like me. Shadow, I whispered, and his tail gave the faintest twitch at the sound of his name. Oh, Shadow. What happened to you, baby? At the sound of his name, something changed in his demeanor. His eyes brightened slightly, and his body language shifted from defensive to cautiously hopeful. He knew his name. He remembered being called by it, probably with love and affection. The fact that a stranger knew it seemed to unlock something in him. Some memory of what it felt like to belong to someone. I don't know how long we sat there on that porch, the storm raging around us. Two broken souls finding something like comfort in each other's presence. The rain soaked through my nightgown until I was shivering as hard as he was, but I couldn't bring myself to leave him. Not when he'd finally stopped trembling quite so violently. Not when those honey eyes had begun to hold something that might have been trust. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating our strange tableau. An elderly woman in a soaked nightgown, kneeling on a porch in the middle of a violent storm, reaching out to a terrified dog who had nowhere else to go. If anyone had seen us, they would have thought we'd both lost our minds. Maybe we had. Maybe sometimes you have to lose your mind a little bit to find your heart again. We need to get you inside, I finally said, though the words felt strange on my tongue. I hadn't invited anyone into this house since the funeral. I hadn't wanted company, hadn't wanted to pretend to be okay for anyone's benefit. The house had become my refuge and my prison, a place where I could grieve without judgment, where I could fall apart in private. But Shadow wasn't anyone. The shadow was broken too. I stood slowly, my knees protesting after kneeling on the wet porch for so long. Shadow watched my every movement, his head tilted slightly to one side. When I moved toward the door, he didn't follow. He just watched with those expressive eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe that the invitation was real. "Come on, sweet boy," I said, patting my leg gently. "Let's get you warm and dry." It took another 10 minutes of gentle coaxing before Shadow finally limped through my back door. His injured paw barely touched the ground, and each step seemed to cause him pain that he bore with a stoicism that reminded me of Robert during his final weeks. Some creatures, I thought, are simply too dignified to complain about their suffering. Once inside, Shadow stood in my kitchen like he couldn't quite believe he was allowed to be there. His whole body was tense, ready to bolt if I changed my mind or raised my voice or did any of the things that had obviously taught him to fear humans. Water dripped from his sodden coat onto my clean floors, but I didn't care. The house had been too clean anyway, too perfect, too much like a museum dedicated to a life that no longer existed. But I wasn't going to do any of those things. Instead, I grabbed every clean towel I could find from the linen closet and began the slow process of drying his sodden fur. He flinched at first when I touched him, his muscles tensing as if expecting a blow. But gradually, as I kept up a steady stream of gentle words, his muscles began to relax. "You're beautiful," I told him as I worked, and it was true. Beneath the mud and matted fur was a magnificent animal. His coat was primarily black with rich tan markings on his legs and chest. His ears were perfectly pointed, alert and intelligent. He was thin, too thin, but his bone structure suggested he should have been a large, powerful dog when properly fed and cared for. As I dried him, I could feel every rib beneath his skin. How long had he been on his own? How long had he been wandering, looking for someone to take him in? The thought made my throat tight with emotion. He was still young, probably no more than 2 years old, but his eyes held the weariness of an old soul who had seen too much pain. His fur, once I'd worked out the worst of the mats and mud, was incredibly soft, thick and plush, the kind of coat that would be gorgeous when properly cared for. I found myself wondering what he'd looked like before whatever had happened to put him on the streets. Had he been someone's pride and joy? Had children played with him in a sunny backyard? Had he slept on someone's bed and been fed treats from the dinner table? I heated up some leftover chicken from the refrigerator, shredding it into small pieces that would be easy for him to digest. Shadow watched my every movement from where he'd settled on the kitchen floor, his eyes tracking me with an intensity that spoke of intelligence and perhaps a little remaining hope. The kitchen filled with the scent of warming chicken, and I saw Shadow's nostrils flare. His stomach made an audible rumbling sound, and I realized he was probably starving. How long had it been since his last real meal? Days? Weeks? When I set the bowl down in front of him, he looked from the food to me and back again, as if asking permission. Only when I nodded and murmured, "Go ahead," did he begin to eat. Even then, he ate delicately, politely, like someone had once taught him proper manners. Someone had loved this dog. Someone had cared enough to train him, to socialize him, to make him into the gentle creature he clearly was beneath all that fear and pain. So what happened? How did he end up alone in my backyard during the worst storm of the season? I watched him eat, noting the way he kept glancing up at me as if to make sure I wasn't going to take the food away. His table manners were impeccable despite his obvious hunger. He didn't gulp or guard his food the way truly feral dogs did. This was a dog who had been part of a family, who had learned to trust humans, who had been betrayed by that trust in some fundamental way. While Shadow ate, I examined his injured paw more closely. It was swollen and tender, with what looked like an infected cut along one of his pads. The area around the wound was hot to the touch and had the distinctive smell of infection. He needed medical attention, antibiotics at the very least. Tomorrow, I decided, tomorrow I would take him to a veterinarian and make sure he got the care he needed. Tonight, he just needed to be warm and safe and fed. I made a bed for him on the kitchen floor using old blankets and pillows, arranging them near the heating vent where the warm air would reach him. The blankets were ones Robert and I had used for picnics when we were young, soft from decades of washing and faded from years of summer sun. It felt right to give them to Shadow, to let them serve a purpose again instead of gathering dust in the linen closet. Shadow watched my preparations with those amber eyes, and when I patted the makeshift bed, he limped over and carefully lowered himself onto the soft surface. For the first time since I'd found him, I saw him truly relax. His head settled onto his paws, his breathing deepened, and his eyes began to drift closed. But every few minutes, he would open them to check that I was still there, as if he couldn't quite believe this wasn't a dream that would end with him back in the cold and rain. I pulled one of the kitchen chairs over near his bed and settled into it, my own exhaustion finally catching up with me. The adrenaline of the rescue was wearing off, leaving me drained but somehow more awake than I'd felt in months. My nightgown was still damp from the rain, and my hair hung in limp strands around my face, but I didn't care. Something fundamental had shifted in my world, and I wasn't ready to leave this moment behind by going upstairs to change into dry clothes. I watched Shadow sleep, studying the way his ears would twitch at small sounds, the way his paws would move slightly as if he were dreaming of running. There was something peaceful about having another breathing presence in the house, something that made the silence feel less oppressive, less like a weight pressing down on my chest. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside my kitchen, wrapped in the warm glow of the overhead light, it felt like we were in our own little sanctuary. For the first time since Robert's death, the house didn't feel empty. It felt like home. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, I dozed off in that chair, and for the first time since Robert's death, I slept without nightmares. I woke to sunlight streaming through the kitchen window and the gentle pressure of a large, warm head resting on my knee. Shadow was sitting beside my chair, looking up at me with those expressive eyes. His tail gave a tentative wag when he saw I was awake, and I realized this was the first time I'd seen him move his tail with anything approaching happiness. "Good morning, beautiful boy," I whispered, running my fingers through his now dry fur. It was softer than I'd expected, thick and plush beneath my palms. "How did you sleep?" His tail wagged a little harder at the sound of my voice, and I realized he was waiting for something. Food, probably. Or maybe he needed to go outside. The practical needs of caring for another living creature were coming back to me slowly. Muscle memory from a lifetime of caring for others. I stood slowly, my joints protesting after sleeping in the chair all night, and opened the back door for him. Shadow limped outside into my fenced backyard, taking care of his business with an efficiency that suggested good house training. Another sign that he'd once been someone's beloved pet. The morning air was crisp and clean after the storm, washed and bright in the way that only comes after violent weather. The backyard was littered with broken branches and fallen leaves, but the sun was shining, and everything seemed to sparkle with residual raindrops. Shadow sniffed around the base of the old oak tree, his tail wagging slightly as he investigated the new scents the storm had brought. While he was outside, I started coffee and found some more chicken to heat up for his breakfast. The normalcy of the routine felt strange and wonderful at the same time. When was the last time I'd had a reason to get up in the morning? When was the last time someone had needed me? Shadow returned to the door and waited patiently for me to let him back in. His limp seemed a little less pronounced this morning, though his paw was still clearly bothering him. I made a mental note to call the veterinarian as soon as their office opened. After he'd eaten, and I'd had my first cup of coffee in months that actually tasted good instead of like liquid sadness, I found myself really talking to him. Not just the gentle reassurances I'd offered during the night, but actual conversation. I told him about Robert, about the garden we'd tended together, about the way my husband used to sing off-key in the shower every morning. I told him about the empty feeling that had taken up residence in my chest, about the way I'd been moving through my days like a sleepwalker, going through the motions of living without actually being alive. Shadow listened to every word, his head tilted attentively, his eyes never leaving my face. He didn't judge. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me I needed to move on, or suggest that Robert would want me to be happy. He just listened with a kind of presence that I hadn't experienced since my husband's death. For the first time in 6 months, I felt heard. Around 9 o'clock, I called the local veterinary clinic and explained the situation. Dr. Martinez, the veterinarian on duty, agreed to see Shadow right away. Getting him into my car proved to be an adventure. He'd clearly never been in a vehicle before, or if he had, the experience hadn't been pleasant. It took patience and several pieces of chicken to coax him into the back seat. The drive to the clinic was my first time out of the house for anything other than grocery shopping or prescription pickups in months. I'd become a hermit, avoiding the well-meaning but painful sympathy of neighbors and acquaintances. The world outside my house had felt too bright, too loud, too full of people who weren't Robert. But today, with Shadow panting nervously in the back seat, I felt like I had a purpose again. I wasn't just Margaret the widow, the object of pity and careful concern. I was Shadow's person, his protector, the one responsible for getting him the care he needed. Dr. Martinez was a kind woman about my daughter's age, with gentle hands and a soft voice that immediately put Shadow at ease. She examined him thoroughly, while I held his head and whispered reassurances in his ear. Her touch was competent and caring, and I could see Shadow beginning to relax under her ministrations. He's been on his own for several weeks at least, she told me as she cleaned and bandaged his injured paw. He's malnourished and has some minor injuries, but nothing that won't heal with proper care. The cut on his paw was infected, but antibiotics should clear that right up. She gave him a thorough checkup, updating his vaccinations and checking for a microchip. There was none. The phone number on his collar turned out to be disconnected, when we tried calling it. Dead end after dead end, each one confirming what I'd already suspected. Shadow had been abandoned, discarded like something that had outlived its usefulness. Whoever owned him before, they're not looking for him now, Dr. Martinez said gently. Are you planning to keep him, Mrs. Thompson? The question hung in the air between us. I looked down at Shadow, who was pressed against my legs as if seeking comfort from the strange smells and sounds of the veterinary clinic. His amber eyes met mine, and I saw something there that I recognized. Hope. Fragile, tentative hope that maybe this time, maybe this human, wouldn't let him down. Yes, I heard myself saying. Yes, I'm keeping him. The words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise Dr. Martinez. I hadn't planned on it. I'd been telling myself I was just helping him until I could find him a proper home. But standing there in that examination room, feeling the warmth of his body against my legs, I realized I didn't want to let him go. I didn't want to go back to that empty house and face the silence alone. Dr. Martinez smiled. He's a lucky dog, Mrs. Thompson. German Shepherds are loyal, intelligent companions. With some love and proper care, he'll make a wonderful addition to your family. Family. The word echoed in my mind as we drove home. I hadn't thought of myself as part of a family since Robert died. I'd been just Margaret, the widow, the woman people spoke about in hushed, pitying tones. But now, with Shadow's warm presence filling the passenger seat where he'd finally agreed to ride, I felt like maybe I could be something more again. The first few days were an adjustment for both of us. Shadow was still skittish around sudden movements or loud noises. The vacuum cleaner sent him hiding under the kitchen table. The garbage truck's hydraulic whine made him cower behind my legs. Someone had taught him to fear loud sounds, sudden movements, raised voices. I learned to move slowly around him, to speak softly, to let him come to me rather than overwhelming him with attention. He was learning to trust again, and I was learning to care for another living being after months of barely caring for myself. I established routines that we both seemed to crave. Morning walks around the neighborhood, though Shadow's injured paw meant we kept them short and slow. Breakfast together in the kitchen, me with my coffee and toast, him with his bowl of high-quality dog food that I'd researched extensively before buying. Afternoons spent in the backyard, me reading on the porch while he explored the garden that Robert and I had planted. Shadow had a particular fascination with the bird bath. He would sit and watch for hours as cardinals and blue jays came to drink and bathe. His focus was intense but gentle, as if he understood that his presence was a privilege that could be revoked if he moved too quickly or made too much noise. It was during one of these afternoon sessions that I made a discovery that broke my heart and explained so much about Shadow's gentle nature. I was deadheading the last of the season's roses when I noticed Shadow had found something buried beneath the overgrown bushes at the back of the yard. He was pawing gently at the dirt, whining softly. When I came over to investigate, I found what had caught his attention. It was a child's toy, a small, stuffed elephant, faded and weather-beaten, but still recognizable. The kind of toy a beloved family dog might have been allowed to play with, might have carried around as his own special treasure. The fabric was worn soft from handling, and one of the ears was partially torn, suggesting years of gentle play. Shadow picked it up gently in his mouth, his tail wagging slowly. He brought it to me and dropped it at my feet, looking up at me with those expressive eyes as if asking if it was okay for him to keep it. My throat closed with emotion. This wasn't random. He'd been drawn to my yard for a reason. Maybe he'd once lived in this neighborhood. Maybe he'd played in this very garden with children who'd loved him and then, for reasons I couldn't imagine, had to give him up. "Of course you can keep it, baby," I whispered, picking up the little elephant and gently brushing the dirt from its worn fabric. "This is your home now. Everything here is yours too." That night, Shadow slept with the stuffed elephant tucked between his paws, and I understood something fundamental about the nature of loss and love. We'd both been abandoned by the people we'd trusted most. We'd both been left to navigate a world that suddenly felt too big and too empty. But somehow, in finding each other, we discovered that broken didn't have to mean worthless. Sometimes, broken things could fit together in ways that made them stronger than they'd ever been whole. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Healing never does. But day by day, I watched Shadow begin to trust, begin to hope, begin to play. His injured paw healed completely, and soon he was running circles around the backyard, chasing squirrels and barking at delivery trucks with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd remembered what joy felt like. More importantly, I watched myself begin to heal too. Having Shadow to care for gave me a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to go to the grocery store and pick up his favorite treats, a reason to take walks around the neighborhood and rediscover the beauty of the world outside my self-imposed isolation. People in the neighborhood began to stop and chat when they saw us on our walks. Shadow, with his magnificent coat now glossy with good health and his intelligent amber eyes bright with contentment, was quite the conversation starter. But more than that, he gave me something to talk about besides my grief. He gave me stories to tell that didn't end in sadness. Mrs. Thompson called my neighbor Ellen one morning as Shadow and I were heading out for our daily walk. "He's absolutely beautiful. You can tell he's happy." She was right. Shadow had developed a spring in his step, a brightness in his eyes that spoke of a dog who knew he was loved. But the comment made me realize something else. People were saying the same thing about me. "You look wonderful, Margaret," my daughter Sarah said during one of our weekly phone calls. "You sound different. Lighter somehow." "It's Shadow," I told her, watching as he played with his stuffed elephant in a patch of afternoon sunlight. "He's been good for me." But it was more than that, and as the weeks turned into months, I began to understand the true nature of what had happened that stormy October night. Shadow hadn't just found a home with me. We'd found healing in each other. I started sleeping in my own bed again, with Shadow curled up on a dog bed beside it. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum, but like a home again, filled with the sounds of life. Shadow's gentle snoring, the click of his nails on the hardwood floors, the jingle of his collar tags as he followed me from room to room. I began cooking real meals again instead of surviving on toast and canned soup. Shadow's schedule demanded regularity, and his obvious enjoyment of mealtimes reminded me of the pleasure that could be found in simple domestic rituals. Most importantly, I started talking about Robert again, not with the devastating sadness that had characterized my grief for so long, but with love and gratitude for the years we'd had together. Shadow was an excellent listener, never growing tired of hearing about the man who'd shared this house with me for so many years. One evening in December, as snow began to fall outside and Shadow dozed by the fireplace with his elephant tucked under his chin, I realized something that took my breath away. I was happy, not the desperate, grasping happiness that comes from trying to fill a void, but the quiet, steady happiness that comes from feeling useful and loved and needed. I was sitting in Robert's old chair, working on a crossword puzzle, when Shadow suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the front door. His ears perked up, and his tail began to wag. A moment later, I heard the sound of a car pulling into my driveway. It was Sarah, my daughter, arriving for an unexpected visit. When I opened the door, she took one look at me and burst into tears. "Mom," she said, pulling me into a fierce hug, "you look like yourself again." Shadow, ever the gentleman, waited patiently for the reunion to wind down before approaching Sarah with a gentle tail wag and a polite sniff of her extended hand. Within minutes, he'd won her heart completely, and I found myself telling her the whole story. About the storm, about finding him broken and afraid, about the slow process of healing we'd undergone together. "He saved you, didn't he?" Sarah said, watching as Shadow performed his favorite trick, shaking hands for her approval. I thought about her words long after she'd returned home to her own family. Had Shadow saved me? Or had we saved each other? Maybe the distinction didn't matter. Maybe what mattered was that two broken souls had found each other in the darkness and discovered that love doesn't end when loss begins. It just changes form. As winter deepened and the anniversary of Robert's death approached, I found myself dreading the day less than I'd expected. Yes, I would always miss my husband. Yes, there would always be a Robert-shaped space in my heart that nothing else could fill. But Shadow had taught me something crucial about the nature of love and loss and moving forward. Love isn't finite. Having room in my heart for an injured German shepherd didn't diminish what I'd felt for Robert. If anything, caring for Shadow had reminded me of my capacity for love, had awakened parts of myself that I'd thought had died with my husband. On the actual anniversary, I took Shadow to visit Robert's grave for the first time. He seemed to understand the solemnity of the occasion, walking quietly beside me and sitting patiently while I told Robert about our four-legged addition to the family. I think you'd like him, I said, running my fingers through Shadow's soft fur. He's got your gentle soul and your stubborn streak. He's teaching me that it's okay to love again. Shadow rested his head against my knee as I spoke, offering the kind of wordless comfort that had become his specialty. On the drive home, I realized that the crushing weight of grief had lifted, replaced by something lighter but no less meaningful. Gratitude for the years I'd had with Robert, for the chance encounter with Shadow, for the reminder that even in our darkest moments, love has a way of finding us. That night, as Shadow and I settled into our evening routine, I reflected on the journey that had brought us together. A year ago, I'd been a woman drowning in grief, convinced that the best parts of my life were behind me. Shadow had been a broken, abandoned dog, lost and afraid in a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. Now we were both whole in ways we'd never been before, not because we'd forgotten our losses or pretended they didn't matter, but because we discovered that healing doesn't mean returning to who you were before. It means becoming someone new, someone shaped by loss but not defined by it, someone who understands that the heart's capacity for love is infinite. Shadow stretched out beside my chair with a contented sigh, his stuffed elephant tucked securely under his chin. His amber eyes, once filled with fear and desperation, now held peace and trust and the kind of deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. As I watched him drift off to sleep, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. I felt excited about tomorrow, about the walk we'd take, the games we'd play, the quiet moments we'd share. I felt excited about the future, about the adventures that awaited us, about the possibility that there were still stories to be written, still joy to be discovered, still love to be given and received. The storm that had brought Shadow to my door had seemed like just another trial in an already difficult season of my life. But sometimes, I realized, storms don't come to destroy us. Sometimes they come to wash away what's no longer serving us and clear the path for something beautiful to take root. Shadow had taught me that broken things can heal, that love doesn't end with loss, but transforms into something deeper and more resilient. That sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the things we least expect. And as sleep began to claim us both, I whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force in the universe had guided a scared, injured German shepherd to my back porch on the darkest night of my grief. Because in saving him, I had discovered that I was still capable of being saved myself. The love we shared wasn't a replacement for what I'd lost. It was proof that the heart's capacity for love is endless, that there's always room for one more soul to call home. That healing isn't about forgetting, but about making peace with the past while embracing the possibility of joy in the future. in the gentle rhythm of Shadow's breathing and the warmth of his presence beside me, I found something I'd thought was lost forever. I found hope. I found purpose. I found proof that even in our darkest storms, love has a way of finding us and reminding us that we're never as alone as we think we are. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new moments of quiet companionship, new opportunities to love and be loved in return. And for the first time in over a year, I couldn't wait to see what they would be.